In all my research and all my endeavors, I had figured out that single families were a great place to invest. And multifamily wasn't a thing, like a term even that I knew. I just knew that apartment buildings were really expensive and for rich people only. And so it wasn't until like I literally stumbled into this. So the job that I was working at the time, I was working as a professional fire protection engineer, traveling all over the country, mostly Western US. But wherever I happened to be, I would just hop on Zillow because I was a real estate investor now. And so I would look at Zillow and see what things were buying for or selling for and renting for. And I realized, like, holy crap, you can buy like a triplex for the same price as you could a single family. And the rents weren't 3x, but they were 2.3 or 2.5x. And I'm like, this is crazy. So I started buying up as much as I could wherever I happened to be where the numbers made sense.
Mhm.
And so like I bought a triplex in Alaska for 300,000. And I'm like, I didn't care where it was. I cared if the numbers made sense. And so that was all fine, well, and good until it just got to be way too overwhelming. Trying to track down six different property managers for six different properties and trying to keep mental space in my head. Which one is which and which filing is due in which state and all this sort of thing. So I got some really great advice from a friend of mine. He says, Michael, go focus on one, maybe two markets, hit them as hard as you can, watch what happens. It'll blow your mind. And I was like, I don't know, man. That's like totally counterintuitive to everything I thought I knew about investing. Diversify, right? You want to spread the risk. But that's what I did. He was a lot further along in his real estate career than me. And that's what I did. And he was right. Like the results totally blew my mind. I was able to get laser focused on one particular market. Then I'm making one phone call to one property manager to get updates about six properties. I get to hone in and really, really learn the market much better than if I was kind of shotgun approaching. If every new market I went into, I had to go relearn that market. Who are the players? What are the rents? What are the economic drivers? What's the market like? And that's all fine, well, and good if you have the time and bandwidth to do that. I was running out of those things. And so I said, I got to go get laser focused. And I fell into multifamily, commercial multifamily investing. So for those of your listeners who might not be familiar, that's 5 units plus in a building. So residential is 1 to 4, a commercial is 5 plus. And again, it was because of the cost. Like my first commercial multifamily property I bought was in Northern Kentucky for $300,000 for an 8 unit.
Wow.
So I was just like, yeah, wow. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So I was going where the numbers made sense. And I was very focused, laser focused on cash flow. That was the whole point of my investing because I said, this is something that I want to replace my job income. I need the dollars today. Appreciation was just kind of a cherry on top, in my opinion.
What market did you end up landing on that you went deep
So
on?
the ones where I'm hitting laser focus is Northern Kentucky, which is called Covington, and then just across the river is Cincinnati, Ohio. So
Hmm.
technically they're two markets, but in effect they're really one.
Yeah, I've done a lot of analysis in that area with my short term rental program, and there's some really great cash flow just because of the affordability. There's still,
Yes.
it's a big population center. There's a lot going on there. So yeah, that I can see how that would make a ton of sense to focus in on. And you're speaking my language, focusing. I highly recommend that to everybody I work with as well with short term rentals. People say, I want to own a vacation rental in every city I want to visit. And I'm like, that's great. But you're going to have a full time job creating a new
Yes.
team in every single location and tracking
Yes.
down, like, what's the laws there? What's building relationships with all the vendors and stuff like that. Whereas you can go deep. We've got all ours, other than we have a secondary market that we just started, but for the most part, all of our properties are within a 5 minute drive. We've got a centralized inventory system where one of the garages we converted into a big inventory system so we can restock all the different properties, and we have a head cleaner there. And
Oh, that's
um,
so clever.
yeah. So I fully agree with you though. People think they need to diversify way too soon, and I think getting in those economies of scale make a huge difference.
Yeah.
So,
And the other thing that I realized, which wasn't on my radar, is like you can diversify within a particular market.
mm,
So like the fact that you're all 5 minutes away, if you went 10 or 15 minutes away, you'd probably be in some different neighborhoods or some different submarkets and you would be diversified.
absolutely, that makes sense. That makes total sense. And after your experience investing in all these different types of asset classes, I know you focused in on the market then that made the most sense for you. what's the one that you think is the best in your experience, and what do you look for now? What's a deal for you?
Oh man, that is a great question, Kirby. It's so hard to answer. And the reason it's so hard to answer is because my wife and I converted our prior two primary residences, say that 5 times fast,
Yeah.
into rentals. So we bought them with the intent of converting them into rentals after we moved out, and we did that. And so from a performance basis, believe it or not, those two are probably our best performing assets, and they're in California and they cash flow, which is really challenging to do. It helps that the interest rate on that debt is like 2.8, so it's kind of an anomaly. But just from a cash flow and appreciation perspective, like those two are probably the best. But from a long term rental perspective, I'd say the Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio market has been amazing. There's been a ton of growth in that area. I would say that in terms of like the long term rentals, the Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati, Ohio markets have been amazing for all the reasons you mentioned. Like it's a very affordable market. They are a very diverse economy, and so there's a lot of economic drivers in that market, which is the whole reason I started investing there in the first place. So people are moving there. It's affordable. They are making good incomes, so they can afford their rent, afford their housing payments. It's very very landlord friendly states. So the laws are very favorable to property owners. Um, and there's been a ton of appreciation like in those markets, both organic and forced. So I think it just checks so many of the boxes for me and what I was looking for. That if we rule out kind of the uniqueness of the California properties, I would say those from a pure investment are going to be the best.
Yeah. And you're still focused on 5 unit plus properties, or are you buying single family as well?
Yeah, I've gotten kind of more opportunistic over the years, and it's funny because when I first started buying these 5 to 12 units was kind of where my sweet spot was. Nobody else was buying them, and so
Mm.
I'm looking around. I'm like what does everybody else know that I don't? Like, what am I missing?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until a couple years later that they kind of became the new hot commodity that everybody wanted. Small commercial multifamily. At the time, it was too big for the mom and pop investors and too small for the institutional players, so the really big players. They didn't want to waste their time with that stuff. So it totally worked for me.
Yeah.
So since then, it's become more popular. Everybody and their brother and sister wants to get into that style of property. So I've been opportunistic. I bought some short-term rentals during the pandemic, kind of like everybody else did. Paid way too much for them at the peak of the market. Got sucked into the gold rush, so to speak. But those were some single-family pickups that we purchased. But so I'm open and looking, always looking.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm a huge fan of that as well. We use, believe it or not, these small multifamily properties, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5 unit properties, as short-term rentals, and those can do phenomenally well too in the right area. You got to obviously be in the right area, but yeah, that's awesome. So one of the big pushbacks I get from a lot of people I talk to is they're like, can you really do this remotely? You just mentioned you lived in California. You live in California. You invest in Ohio, which is quite a distance apart. So how do you do this remotely? And what do you recommend to people who are thinking about that?
So it's funny because I get the same question from the folks that I work with all the time,
Yeah.
and I think it's a mindset thing. Like for me, it was all that I knew, and so it was a little bit easier. So doing it remotely was kind of all that I knew, and so I was blissfully ignorant, I would say. And it wasn't until so my first property that I purchased was in Southern California, like I was sharing with you. And that was a market that was like a 5 hour, 6 hour drive from where I lived. So remote ish kind of. And so I was like, oh, like I'm not used to being able to drive by these properties anyhow. So what's the difference if it's a 6 hour drive or a 6 hour plane ride? I'm still having a manager manage it. I'm still doing the due diligence. I'm still getting all the right people involved. So it didn't matter to me. I wasn't someone that was used to being able to go drive by these properties. And so once I realized, okay, well, I don't need to do this just in California or in the market I live in. I could literally go anywhere. The whole United States became my egg, and frankly, the world at that point. And so I think for people that get caught up on that, like I got to go see it, I got to go touch it. Like do that. Go to the market that you're interested in investing and I say this with a caveat because I didn't go to the Northern Kentucky market when I first started investing there. I made several purchases before I had ever been there.
Wow.
And the thing that I share with people is like, picture this. You go to a remote market, you fly there for the weekend, and you're about to go on a property tour, and you drive yourself to breakfast, and you have a crummy wait staff that gives you attitude, and the food sucks, and you go out to your rental car and you got a parking ticket. You're not going to have a great time the rest of that trip. I can almost guarantee it. And so you're going to start bringing in these personal biases into what should otherwise be a purely data driven decision. Now, conversely, if you have an amazing time and have the most wonderful wait staff and everybody is super friendly, you might, again, put your own personal bias and think, wow, what an amazing town. I want to invest here, even though the economics may not make the most sense. And so when we can remove the emotion or that personal bias from the decision, I have found that to be a better decision making tool as opposed to letting my emotions get in the way. And so for better or for worse, again, however that trip turns out to be is going to likely influence the decision. But so if you can be truly and purely data driven, it makes this whole remote thing much easier, in my opinion.
Yeah, I fully agree. And you not only were remote, but you were living in a van, working full time and buying real estate. So what was that like? I mean, how did you manage all that?
Yeah, it was, man, it was a trip. It was really
Yeah.
funny. Like, so we were all over doing van life during the pandemic. And so the thing that I think most people don't realize about buying real estate is that you need internet connection and a cell phone and like access to a notary, which you go to any UPS store in the country, they will have.
Hmm.
So we would, wherever we happened to be, if we were doing a deal like out in Ohio and I happened to be in Colorado, we drove to the notary and got the paperwork signed and scanned it back to him and then emailed it to, or and then sent it overnight back to the title company. And it was just as if I had been living at my home in California. So I think the funniest piece of doing this remotely though was actually, so my wife and I were traveling for the better part of a year after we first got married, and we were in Latin America, and a deal came up, and I was like, oh, we had to jump on it, and so we were in Panama, and I was like, okay, well, how am I going to sign these documents? Because Ohio at the time wouldn't allow for like electronic or worldwide notaries; they needed
Hmm.
wet signatures, and so I
Oh,
was like,
wow.
okay, well, I looked it up, and I said, okay, I can go to the embassy and in Panama City in the capital, and I can make an appointment there, and they'll allow me four notary signatures. I'm like, oh shoot, I think I need like 8 or 9, so I don't think that's gonna work. So I'm like, okay. So I ended up flying from Panama City to Miami, Florida in the morning, Ubered to from the airport to the local UPS store, got the signatures I needed, Ubered back to the airport and flew back to Panama that night, and met up with my wife for dinner. And so I was like, this is nuts, man. But where there's a will, there's a way. And so there's
That's right.
totally ways to do it.
That's when you know you're a big time investor, when you're flying between countries to sign
Yeah.
documents.
It was really funny. It was really, really funny.
That's awesome. No, that's great. I want to hear a little bit about financial independence. It's a term that has grown legs over the last decade or so, quite a bit, and a lot of people define it different ways. I'm curious what your definition is of FI, and then what you would recommend to somebody who's just starting, who that's their goal. What are the first steps you'd recommend taking?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kirby, and I think we think similarly that it has changed and metamorphosized over the years. So
Yeah.
for me, what it was is being able to pay your daily living expenses from income other than your job. And so whatever your daily living expenses look like, if you're covering those with income, again, not associated with your job, you're it. And I know the bigger pockets folks have coined, lean fire or fat fire or big fire. I forget all the various terms, but
Yeah.
that was what it was for me. And so when I hit that, it was much easier to do because my wife and I said, hey, well, let's get out of the country. Let's go travel for a bit. So I was earning money in rental dollars and US dollars and spending in pesos or colones or whatever the currency where we were happened to be. And we intentionally went to countries that had a cheaper cost of living where the dollar was strong. So that was fairly easy is the wrong word, but we were able to hit that milestone much earlier than if we had been staying in the US. So once we came back to the US, actually, it was during that trip when I had these two fires. I got a phone call from my property manager on a Sunday. He's like, "You're probably wondering why I call you on a Sunday." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm in Costa Rica. What's up?" He's like, "Ah, we had a fire." So that was a bummer. So I was like, "Okay, we need money now." So that's actually when I started going back to work, and I essentially fell out of financial independence, so to speak, because my costs started skyrocketing and income was not enough to cover that. So I was okay. Let me go earn some additional income to be able to pay for the hole in this proverbial sinking ship, so that I don't lose the thing. And I think that's something that not a lot of people talk about. My guess is because it probably doesn't happen to most people. I feel like I was a bit of a unique circumstance that falling out of financial independence. But by that same token, if we think about it in the sense of having a family or getting married or doing something other than you're currently doing, your life circumstances changing, it could very easily happen. And so, birth of a child is the big one. Like your expenses are likely to go up. And so I think it's really important that people be thinking about, okay, what is my living situation today, but also what would I like it to be in the future? And so how do I plan for that and not necessarily leave their job the minute they can cover their living expenses in today's dollars and today's expenses, because it is likely to change. And so the other thing I would say to people who are just getting started is like, don't leave your job too soon. There are so many benefits to having a job. The ease of lending is leaps and bounds above that of someone who's a sole proprietor. I ran into this issue. I had lots of great rental income, but the bank was like, "You don't have this for 2 years." I literally couldn't get a loan, so we had to use my wife's W-2 to go refinance our property. So it was more challenging than I knew about, and then so many other people make it out to be. The other thing I would say is, if you're just getting started and this is something that's important to you, live as far below your means as humanly possible. I was working as an engineer, earning a great salary in the Bay Area, California. I had 5 roommates. People looked at me and they're like, "What are you doing? You could afford to live on your own." I'm like, "I could, but I'm not going to, because this other thing over here is super important to me." I mean, my wife and I lived with those same roommates in my bachelor pad house after we got married, because this was something that was so important to us. And so I don't know, I remember who said it. It might be a Dave Ramsey quote. It's like, live like no one now so you can live like no one else later. And so I would say be willing and ready to sacrifice stuff, um, and do things differently than other people. And then I would say the third piece of advice for someone just getting started is look for a job that is going to pay for a lot of your cost of living. And so this is kind of niche, but because I was an engineer traveling all over the country, they paid for my cell phone, they paid for my internet, they paid for all my travel, and I was gone all the time. And so, oh, and they paid for my car, like car insurance. I had full medical, dental, health insurance type stuff. But whenever I was on the road, I was incurring zero costs. They would
Mm.
pay for my meals, and I had a company credit card. So like I would pay for all the things that I needed to live my life out on the road. And so when I was living at home, it was like food and my rent. And because I was living with roommates, I didn't have, my rent was very inexpensive. So think about ways to engineer your life to be able to maximize your savings. And so those are a couple different ways to go about it. And I happen to be doing both. And so definitely felt like it was a cheat code for me to be getting ahead during all this.